60% mental and 40% physical.
Math was never our strong suit, but breaking down Ohio State football is. Sit back and join us for Buckeye Grove Instant Access, part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network.
You can do it!
Brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. Post-game thoughts, immediate analysis, and much, much more to put the big game into perspective. Without any further delay of game, here's your host, Kevin Noon.
Kevin, goddammit.
Welcome to the BIA podcast. I am your host, Kevin Noon. That is the Buckeye Grove Instant Access podcast, the BIA podcast. It is Wednesday. It'll probably be Wednesday afternoon by the time I get this posted. Got an interesting story to tell. I will here in a second, but let me bring in Griffin Strom, our excellent team writer over at Buckeye Grove. Griffin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. We tried to do this one yesterday, but we're going to have to take a second crack at it today.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to be talking about some Ohio State football lines that have been put out by South Point Casino. We're going to talk about NIL, name, image, likeness. But as Griffin alluded to, we recorded this podcast yesterday on Tuesday. Not the one that you're hearing, but we recorded the entire podcast, and we were in our goodbyes. And for whatever reason, I'm kicking around like a 4-year-old, kick the plug, kill the power to the board, lose the entire podcast. We went about 45 minutes. I'm not sure we'll go 45 minutes a day. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Lost the entire thing. Neither Griffin nor myself wanted to go and do another 45-minute show right on the heels of it. It would have had about zero energy, juice, if you will, as Kerry Combs and the Buckeyes like to use the term. So instead of having a juiceless podcast, we decided to put it on the shelf for a day, and now we're doing it here on Wednesday. And hopefully it's every bit as good as the one that we recorded yesterday that nobody will ever get to hear because it's somewhere in the ether now. I mean, legitimately, we were in the final moments of it, just about ready to hit the closing music, and we lost the whole damn thing.
Yeah, that one will be locked in the vault for future generations of BIA listeners to speculate on what exactly was said in that podcast.
But we'll do our best to try and jump back in with all of that stuff, and we're going to get right away with the lines, because if we're honestly speaking, this is something much easier for the average Ohio State fan or the average fan in general to wrap their head around, more so than NIL, which is something that we're all still kind of learning, but we will get into that in segment 2. And, to jump right into it, South Point Casino released 2 pages of lines for their quote-unquote games of the year, and 4 games were listed for Ohio State. And, of course, Griffin, who's on top of everything, immediately writes a story on it. So, instead of stealing your thunder, I'll kind of let you recap those lines and kind of what you mentioned in your story. We'll go into a little bit more.
Yeah, so obviously the South Point Casino in Las Vegas, they picked almost 100 college football games for the 2021 season. They labeled as kind of their games of the year. And so obviously we took a look to see, the Ohio State matchups that are on that list. And they've got 4 of them, starting with Ohio State, Oregon on September 11th, and then 3 Big Ten matchups for Ohio State, which include Indiana on October 23rd, the following week then against Penn State, and then obviously the game against Michigan on November 27th. Those were the 4 Ohio State games that the South Point Casino had marked down on their games of the year. All of those, however, Ohio State comes in as a double-digit favorite in each of those games. 13-point favorites in 3 of those, and then a 12-point favorite in the other one there. And it's just kind of funny, honestly, that the games that are considered Ohio State's 4 toughest matchups in 2021, the early betting odds for those all favor Ohio State by a couple of scores. So that's just kind of an indication of where people kind of stand with Ohio State in their recent dominance in the Big Ten, and even going up against a tough opponent like Oregon, a tough non-conference opponent like Oregon early in the season.
Exactly, and as I kind of go through these, we go right away to Oregon, a team that Ohio State's played 9 times before. Ohio State has won all 9 of those games. Last time they played was in the College Football Playoff Championship game, Ohio State's 2014 season championship. Won that game going away after it got a little close and was a 1-point game. But, you sit there and you look at these. So should we just sit there and say that, Ohio State is about 2 touchdowns better than anybody that they will play during the regular season the rest of the way? I mean, I know that these early lines are put out, and a lot of times, it's to generate interest, and there certainly are some parameters and limitations that are set on these early bets or whatever, and what the line looks like here, what is it, May 26th, and what the line looks like, August 29th, maybe, night and day difference or whatever. But certainly a huge amount of respect for a team that doesn't know who their starting quarterback is, really is unsure with 5, 6 guys who are going to be in the defensive back 7. I mean, a team that, yes, made it to the championship game, but has some guys to replace.
Yeah, and I'll throw some numbers at you here, though. And this is why I think it shouldn't be that surprising to see the odds being as they are. Ohio State's won 21 straight games against Big Ten opponents. They've got at least a 4-game win streak against every team in the Big Ten East. And all of the 3 Big Ten opponents listed on these 4-game odds here are obviously in the Big Ten East. Against Indiana, I mean, they've won 26 in a row, 25 if you take out the vacated win in 2010. Even Penn State, they've won four games in a row against now, and that seemed to be their most kind of contentious back and forth rivalry for a few years there. Talking about 2016, 17, 18. And then Michigan, I mean, they haven't gotten a win over Ohio State in 10 years. So when you look at all those things, and then you factor in the fact that, 13 or a 13-point spread might seem like a lot right now, but then when you're looking back at some of Ohio State's performances against Big Ten teams last year, if you look at Ohio State's game against Penn State last year, for example, they won by 13 points. And I think a lot of Ohio State fans kind of felt like Ohio State could have beaten them by, much more in that game. So I think a 13-point margin might seem like a lot right now, but I mean, think about Ohio State's last several games against Michigan. I mean, they've beaten them by a lot more than 13 points. So I think, while it might seem like, wow, Ohio State's favored, that much against their toughest opponents, I mean, that's just what we've seen the past several years, even, with the fact that Ohio State will be having to replace a couple, really key positions. I think that there's just kind of an overall sense that, Ohio State's just going to reload.
And at risk for people saying, oh, there goes Noon again, being a homer or whatever, you talk about Ohio State's toughest opponent. You're not talking about Michigan, are you? Because they certainly, through the years, the last several years have not been Ohio State's toughest opponent. And I want to kind of go back into the short-term Wayback Machine. Last year, I mean, obviously Ohio State and Michigan didn't play. The game's supposed to be in Columbus. Michigan was going through a COVID pause again. And this was on the heels of before everything went completely bonkers and whatnot, and it looked like we were at least going to have a season before we didn't have a season, allegedly. And I certainly have my sourcing to believe that this happened at least in some way, shape, or form. There was a bit of a dust-up between Ohio State head coach Ryan Day, Michigan head coach Jim Harbaugh about something. I'm not going to speculate on that, and that Ryan Day, in no uncertain terms, said something either there or amongst his team about wanting to hang 100 on Michigan. So, while maybe I'm sitting there and I'm looking at all these lines, and we certainly haven't even talked about the games that aren't quote-unquote games of the year according to South Point Casino, I don't know if 13 is enough in that Michigan game, especially when you factor in it's the last game of the regular season. Whoever the quarterback is, unless Ohio State has to play multiple along the way for one reason or another, is going to have 11 games under their belt or whatnot. But, just looking at that game in a vacuum, does that one, is that line too low? And I know it's really difficult this far out. I mean, if they came out and said Ohio State by 24.5, I mean, I think it might break the internet. I really think it might break the internet or whatnot. But would you be surprised November 21st to see Ohio State as a 20-point road favorite against Michigan if things keep trending the way that they have? And I know that Ohio State doesn't have Don Brown to kick around anymore in terms of Michigan's defense. And I don't think this is going to be a terrible Michigan team, but I don't think this is going to be a Michigan team that's going to finish second in the Big Ten East either. But would you be surprised to see that line swell to 20 going into that week?
Yeah, well, I think the respect for the nature of this rivalry is what keeps, a preseason line from getting too crazy, even factoring in the fact that Ohio State has been so dominant in the rivalry in recent years. I still think that, just the fact that the rivalry has such a storied history of, throw out what the teams did in the regular season. It's the game in a vacuum could go either way. That's kind of the line that you're sold about the game anyway. In the past 10 years, maybe it hasn't been quite that way. But that's why I think, even though a lot of people would not be shocked to see Ohio State beat Michigan by 3 touchdowns this year, that's why the line is still going to be a little bit closer. But still, I mean, at some point, you would look at that as a pick'em game or something like that, just based on, the tradition of the programs and whatnot. But it just goes to show how far that gap's gotten, that we're talking about a 13-point Ohio State being favored by 13 as being, possibly far too low a line.
When you look at those 4 games, and this is a question I didn't ask you yesterday, so look, bonus coverage by my mess up by kicking the plug. Which of those 4 lines that are notated in the story do you think is the most out of whack?
Most out of whack.
Either too high, too low. Which one do you sit there and look at and it's like, that's the one that I just don't know about that one?
I'm not surprised by any of them, to be honest, but I will say, and this is a point I was talking about yesterday when we recorded, was just that, the Indiana game is one that's really interesting to me because it seemed like Indiana took such big strides last season. And they were really selling this line after the Ohio State game, which they obviously lost by only 1 touchdown, that they came off of the field in Columbus that day in November, thinking that they were actually the better team in that game. They were the team that was coming on, really strong in the second half. They were the team that stormed back and almost, had a possession. The final possession that, they could have tied the game up or even won the game on that final possession, had things went differently. That's a game, that's definitely circled on my calendar as being of particular high interest for Ohio State, just because that game was so fun last year. And it's just interesting to see that just based on last year for Indiana, that hasn't swayed the odds makers to think that Indiana might be, only 1 score away from Ohio State. It seems like, the odds makers are still thinking, Ohio State's going to have a pretty wide advantage over Indiana, despite how things went last year.
Moving away from those 4 games, and for anybody who knows anything about football or lines or whatever, we're not in a situation to where you just keep your foot on the gas for the whole 60 minutes and try and put up as many points as you can. There's the term calling off the dogs very much exists in sports, especially collegiate sports. So, if you look at Ohio State in one of these games against one of the teams that might be just grossly overmatched, you can't sit there and install, truthfully, a 70-point line. Though I do remember seeing some lines in the 70s back in the day, and by that I mean like when Oregon had Chip Kelly at the helm, and they were playing Pullman Barber College or somebody along those lines. I remember a Florida State game back before they fell off the table and they were playing Savannah State. I think that line was in the 70s. Ohio State certainly knows the value of being able to get the 2s and 3s in after not having a lot of that opportunity last year, just because of the uncertain nature of the schedule, about having guys who just weren't available in certain weeks. Just so many different things that were going on. But it got me to thinking about games, and I know it's not fair to just be picking on teams, but if we're being honest, Akron wasn't a very good MAC team last year, and Ohio State plays them week 4. What could a line be in something like that, or the week after that at Rutgers? And I give Greg Schiano a lot of credit. The Scarlet Knights were starting to turn around a little bit, or the week after that against Maryland. I mean, especially with an open week the following week. Could we see 40-point lines there? I mean, unfortunately, I don't have a line history in front of me to see what some of the bigger lines have been through the last 5 years. But if Ohio State is a 12 to 13-point favorite against the games that are supposed to be competitive, I mean, you would sit there and think that it would be a no-brainer that these lines should be 4x against teams that they're absolutely just going to be up 14-0 the second they get off the bus.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking there, 40 was the number that, I was rattling around in my head when it comes to a matchup with Akron or somebody like that. When it comes to Maryland and Rutgers, I tend to think that those teams will get a little more, just a little bit more respect from odds makers, even though we've seen Ohio State destroy them by, 40 points in the past. The real problem with some of that is, Ohio State's going to put the points on the board. The only thing that could, eat into that spread is kind of the proliferation of the pass attack, and especially with Ohio State being susceptible to the pass last year. Certain teams, put up points against Ohio State in games that otherwise could have been, much more lopsided. Like you look at the Rutgers game last year, they pulled out all those trick plays. They still lost by 22 points. But I think that was the closest game those two teams have ever actually played. But still, that it wasn't a 40-point spread. Ohio State put points on the board, but if the defense gives up 3 touchdowns or something, then suddenly it's not quite as widespread. Now, do I think Akron will put up a lot of points against Ohio State? I do not. But do I think that Rutgers or Maryland these days could probably stumble their way into a few scores against Ohio State? I tend to believe so.
Yeah, and we will certainly hear about it from Buckeye Nation coming off the heels of last season and a very un-Ohio State-like defensive effort from the start of the season to the finish. So, yeah, that's exactly, when it comes to these lines, I don't think that there should be a concern about Ohio State's ability to put up the points. It's certainly what is the ability going to be to keep the other team off the board. It's a lot easier to sit there and say, okay, you're going to cover a 40-point spread when it's, 56-0. Yeah, you cover that going away. But, if you sit there and you have a couple of breakdowns, especially, if you call the dogs off, bring your 2s and 3s in, and they give up 17 points or whatever, and then, then you start getting into the point of where every point matters, if you're in a state where sports wagering is legal and all of that stuff. I mean, I would hate to get into all of that, but I guess if we're spending 18 minutes here plus talking about lines, obviously we're not shying away from the popularity of sports wagering, if you will.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Ohio State, the sports betting stuff is probably going to start gearing up here pretty soon to actually come into practice here. So, we might even have, more to talk about with that down the line. But yeah, it's certainly interesting to look at some of these lines and some of the, non-Ohio State matchups as well.
You're listening to the BIA podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon. I'm joined by Griffin Strom. We are talking about some early lines that came out, and we'll kind of keep it in the same area code right now as we talk about future schedules and some other things. Other news happened this week. As we all know, Ohio State's trip to Eugene in 2020 was canceled when the season was canceled for the Big Ten and not to be reviewed, only to be brought back, but it was a Big Ten only schedule. And that important game that everybody was looking forward to, Ohio State at Oregon, was a casualty. Couple things. Ohio State is now agreed that Oregon's payout will be $3.5 million, which certainly is well above market value right now in terms of what you are getting to go in and play somewhere. Certainly Oregon is not going to be getting the type of money that it would if it had its home game, but Ohio State and Oregon also have gone and signed another home and home deal in the future, 2032, 2033. In 32, they'll be at Oregon. In 33, they will be in Columbus again. I would say book your tickets, book your airfare, but you've got a little bit of time there. So that's certainly kind of, we're talking about games that are 11 years out. I mean, we're going to go through television contracts coming up for many conferences before then. Certainly as name, image, likeness and some things happen, we could, the landscape of college football could be very different by then, but I think it was a good move by both programs to try and make good, because the truth of the matter is that I don't see anything, and we'll talk about some future series in a minute. I don't see any opportunity for Ohio State to truthfully be able to do anything much before 2029. So they're only going a couple years out from there to try and make good.
Right. And it's kind of funny because, we talked earlier about the Ohio State's played Oregon 9 times in the past. They've only played in Eugene one time. They've only played at Oregon one time of those 9, and they were supposed to obviously last year. And it's just kind of funny that they didn't last year, and so it ends up being, well, we'll play there 10 years down the line, 12 years down the line, as a consolation for that game being made up. But yeah, I think some of the stuff was interesting with the 3.5 million, and we were kind of kicking around, what some normal figures are in that type of situation usually. But yeah, I mean, an exciting matchup for Ohio State for sure. Haven't played obviously since that 2015 national championship game. What's really interesting is, like, you talk about how the landscape of college football can change. When they schedule these games like a decade down the line, like you're looking at some big powerhouse teams you schedule 10 years down the line, and by that point, like those programs could be in a completely different place. Teams that were at the top of the heap, one decade, following decade, it could be a lull period for that program. It'll be very interesting to see where these two programs are at 10 years down the line, especially Oregon.
Right, and I was just saying a perfect example of that is when Ohio State signed its series with Cal Berkeley. And, there's a very different team when Aaron Rodgers is there, and then the 2-game series that Ohio State ended up playing against Cal, they were, just a shell of the team that they were when Penn was put to paper to sign those contracts. So you just don't know.
Right. And Oregon, hasn't exactly been, at the top of the heap since, that period of time, a half decade ago, when Ohio State was, meeting them in the national championship with guys like, Marcus Mariota, the LaMichael Jameses of the world, and guys like that.
So it got me to thinking about when you look at some of these upcoming deals that they have. I mean, obviously they're coming off of the end of this Oregon deal, and then starting in 2022, they've got a series with Notre Dame, and then I'm going to skip some games because sorry, San Jose State, and some of these one-offs, nobody cares about those. You got a series against Washington, a series against Texas, Boston College, Alabama, Georgia, and Oregon. Obviously, everybody is looking toward 27 and 28 when they've got the series against Alabama. That certainly is one that's been a long time coming. Ohio State sporadically plays Notre Dame, but it's been pretty sporadic. I certainly remember a couple of series against Washington through the years. I certainly remember series against Texas. But Alabama in 27 and 28, and then Georgia in 30 and 31. Again, big ifs if those happen and where where these teams are at. I mean, we're not that far away from, pre-Saban days in Tuscaloosa when Mike Shula really couldn't lead Alabama to Alabama-type standards. But what series, out there really piques your interest?
Yeah, and Texas is kind of a perfect example of what we were just talking about because, if you think about that series in the 2000s or something, Texas is right at the top of the very tip top of the college football landscape in that decade. But then now you look at the 2010s, that has not been the case. And then, going out another few years, what will that series look like? But I will say that obviously Alabama and Georgia, those are two, just monumental series between teams that right now are really in that top 5 year in and year out of this modern, college football playoff landscape that we have today. So you would think, you circle those ones, but then you don't know, like years down the line, like could we see one of those programs, have suffer a dip at all? That remains to be seen. One of the ones that out of that list, maybe no one will is not jumping off of the paper at anybody, is that Boston College series. I just think it's very interesting because, obviously if Ryan Day is still around at Ohio State, he has the Boston College connection. There's the Jeff Hafley connection. While he only was at Ohio State for one season, I think everyone thought super highly of him and of what he would be capable of doing once he left Ohio State as well. So it'll be interesting to see, what he does with that program, and just all of Ryan Day's current staff's kind of connections with Boston College, because he cut his teeth at that program for a long time. So you've got like Al Washington played at Boston College, did he not?
Correct.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ties there with that program, and it'll just be interesting to see if Jeff Hafley can build that program up into something where those games would be exciting years down the line.
If Jeff Hafley builds that program up, he won't be there in 26 and 27. If he doesn't build that program up, he probably won't be there in 26 and 27. I mean, it's close enough that maybe if they're kind of mid-tier or whatnot, that he could still be there. But I'm of the mindset that it might be whoever his successor is at that point. But you just don't know. You don't know. I think it could be a very interesting series. I mean, obviously, the thought of being able to go up and see a game in Chestnut Hill in 2027 is very appealing, but you just don't know. You just don't know. I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of games of that Power 5, yet maybe not a premier Power 5 that end up getting bought out. And I'm sure there's some people listening on here who are screaming at their computer or their car as they're listening to this podcast, saying, whatever happened to the Georgia series or the Tennessee series that was there, that was scheduled years ago and that fell off? And that was really a victim of when the Big Ten and the Pac-12 went into a scheduling agreement, and that may not even be the proper term, but they had a deal in place to where they were going to try and every year have across sports, it was just not a football thing, but that they were going to have games to where the two conferences would showcase against each other. And then once they went into that agreement, Ohio State needed to clear some inventory. That Big Ten Pac-12 agreement was very short-lived, and by the time the dust settled, those contracts had already been canceled with those two SEC teams, and here we are, and we're going to have to wait until 27 and 28. But before we take our break, any other thoughts on future schedules, lines, anything of that nature that maybe we haven't touched upon?
I guess I would just say, another series that's a little bit closer for Ohio State that people can really probably start to sink their teeth into a little bit more is that Notre Dame series. That's probably going to be a great couple matchups there for Ohio State. And what year are they playing them again?
That series starts in 22. 22's in Columbus and 23's in South Bend.
Yes, I mean that's around the corner. That's going to be a real fun series as well, and something that you won't have to wait 10 years for.
There you go. So good Lord willing, be there for those games. Can't wait. 22's non-conference schedule: Notre Dame, Arkansas State, and Toledo. 23 San Jose State, Western Kentucky, and then at Notre Dame. So still a little too far out to be booking your tickets to anything on those, but at least now you know. We're going to put this one to bed. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about name, image, likeness, the good, the bad, and the ugly. All of that and more coming up here on the BIA podcast. Egg Water Conditioning has been treating well in city water in Central Ohio with American-made water filtration products for over 60 years. Have a water quality problem? The water treatment experts at Hague know how to solve it. Not sure if your water softener is working? They will test, inspect, and sanitize any brand of water softener for only $20. Schedule a system checkup or water test today by calling 614-836-2195 or visit them online at HagueH2O.com. That's HagueH2O.com. Welcome back to the BIA podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon, joined by Griffin Strom. We just talked for about a half hour about scheduling and lines, and now into the meat of things with the name, image, likeness. And probably not a more polarizing topic out there today in terms of today's terms. Paying players on one side, people are like, you're screwing up amateur status. On the other side, you're allowing players to profit from their name, image, and likeness. You know, they are making oodles and oodles of cash for universities, you know, while they're being compensated with a free education and not coming out with student loan debt. But they're also, you know, getting, you know, worked to death in terms of trying to maintain the student side, the athlete side, just the battle on the body, just a lot to really look at with this, and, you know, no real easy answers. And we haven't even started to talk about the bill that's been introduced in Ohio.
Yeah, and that's kind of, you know, that was the main thing this week was on Monday. Obviously, an Ohio State senator, you know, announced that, you know, they're putting they proposed a bill on Monday with an effective date for July 1st, which seems like a pretty quick turnaround here. You know, for student athletes in the state to be able to profit off of their name, image, and likeness rights, as long as they give their universities a 15 days notice. Some other, you know, interesting details are that, you know, student athletes will not be able to sign deals with marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, or casinos. They will be able to hire agents to assist in securing these endorsements. And then the latest kind of news, Ohio State wise, was just yesterday. The university announced that they've partnered with like an athlete marketing program called Open Doors to and they're going to have like educational sessions with all of the Buckeye student athletes to kind of walk them through, you know, building up their brand and you know, maximizing their market value and things of that nature, so that they're not going to feel, you know, just confused when all this does theoretically kick in here in July. And they're actually going to have some basis for, you know, what are my steps to actually, you know, monetizing my name, image, and likeness once that's all allowed.
So much to take in here. I mean, you've got states that already have bills in place. Some, you know, the earliest ones will come online July 1st. You have other states that might have different dates that are rapidly trying to get to July 1st. It's definitely a sense of urgency for Ohio to get there, doing an emergency provision to be able to push this through a standalone legislation with a July 1st start date. I guess, you know, where I want to start is that there are a lot of things going on with NIL. There's the Alston case that's in front of the Supreme Court, and it has an indirect impact on NIL. Then you have the D1 Council that is working on something as well. That could maybe come online by the end of June, but this Ohio bill really is in place to keep Ohio collegiate athletes. And, you know, we look at this from an Ohio State level. This is an Ohio State podcast, obviously. We're probably not thinking as much about Mount Union and Tiffin, or even move into bigger schools, Cincinnati, Ohio University, MAC schools. We're not thinking on that level. We're thinking on Ohio State. But this is to protect the athletes who move forward under the dictation of this bill and monetize their NIL. The NC2A cannot come in and sanction amateur status or anything like that. So, you know, that I think that was one of the most interesting things that I learned at the presser right off the bat, that was kind of the way that they were going about this.
Right. And, you know, it looked for a while, you know, in 2019, early 2020, there was a lot of momentum behind, it seemed, NCAA-wide legislation for being, pro NIL rights and whatnot. But then it kind of got derailed, with the pandemic and everything like that. Gene Smith said that he still thinks it's important for there to be, NCAA-wide legislation on this and federal legislation as well. And he thought that, something probably should have been passed, already in the NCAA. However, because that's kind of stalled out, just to a certain extent, I think it was very important for Ohio, at the state level to move forward in the legislative process, because there are several other states that have started to put this stuff in practice, and I think there's 5 states that have stuff going into effect in July, and so I think that's a big reason why Ohio is trying to kind of really speed up the process so that they can also be ready with this stuff in July, because obviously, like, in terms of a competitive edge with other schools, I mean, Ohio does not want to be behind in that. If you're Ohio State, in the recruiting advantage and everything like that, and I mean, the senator even joked at the press conference on Monday that they can't let Michigan win in anything, and so that was while that was a joke, it was also like, that it is kind of serious, because they're putting in an emergency provision to get this passed, in a very short order here, and obviously a big reason why is so that they can keep up with some of these other states that have this going into effect really soon.
Right, and I mean, obviously the joke there was about Michigan, but I think the concern needs to be more about these bills that are already through in terms of Florida, Alabama, Georgia. I mean, places like that. I mean, you don't want to be recruiting Florida kids against the University of Florida, or Georgia kids against UGA, or really anybody against Alabama, and they're all able to say, well, if you come here, we've already got we've already got it in the process to where you're able to do this. Where Ohio was, there were only 11 states that didn't have anything moving prior to this Monday presser. I mean, and obviously the bill was being drafted. It wasn't something that was done on Monday morning. I mean, we even knew about this on Friday that something was coming up. But there's certainly a sense of urgency. And is it a matter of that Ohio was waiting to pick and choose from the best things that it saw elsewhere? Was Ohio just really dragging its feet? I mean, I don't know if either of us can truthfully answer that. But now, I mean, it's just going to be a case of where they're going to have to try and move this legislation through quickly, because counting on the D1 Council to be able to do all this, or what might happen in the Supreme Court, or even worse yet, Congress wanting to take a couple swings at this, not sure any of those are the avenue you want to go when time is of the essence.
Yeah, 100%. And, it was interesting, like, how quickly this materialized. Like, there wasn't a whole lot of, lead up. It seemed it was just kind of like, okay, now we've got this bill, and now, it's going to pass according to the senator, really soon here. I also think it's just interesting how, Ohio State really takes, such pride in, like, its branding and its social media when it comes to the athletic department and stuff like that. It was unsurprising, even though I haven't seen what other schools or states are doing in terms of this, like, educational, athlete marketing stuff that Ohio State announced yesterday. It was just very unsurprising to see that Ohio State is very proactive and really trying to, offer something that they can really, they can really say to, future athletes and their current athletes, you're not just going into the wild, wild west here. Like, we are going to walk you through, best practices and really trying to maximize your ability to bring in money through these opportunities with these resources we've provided for you. And that was just interesting to see.
Exactly. I agree with you on that. You're listening to the BIA podcast. I'm Kevin. You're listening to Griffin Strom, as well as we're talking about name, image, likeness. And I think we'd both be the first to admit that neither of us are attorneys. We both looked at the bill, but, even today I'm still learning bits and pieces. And a lot of that's based on what somebody else writes, and I just have to kind of go through it. But a couple of other quick and dirty facts from this that I believe are the case. There's students will be allowed to have agents, for lack of a better term, certified agents that could help them put together these deals in place. I mean, this is not something that's just only going to be about football and basketball. I mean, there was the belief by Gene Smith and others that for like Olympic sport athletes, and certainly, using the term non-revenue sports, it's kind of has a little bit of a dirty meaning to it. But it is what it is, but there's certainly going to be opportunities there. That 15-day window to kind of be able to sort some things out. The university, it was really brought up that the university will not have veto power, but there are going to be, I guess, some provisions in there to where you can't sign an Adidas deal if you're at a Nike school and then go out there and play in Adidas shoes, cleats, or whatever. So, there's still certainly going to be some things there, and I think that it's certainly going to be just like the transfer portal or anything else. I think you'll see some things that'll be put in place, and then in a year, certain things will be tweaked. This is not going to be any sort of a final process.
Yeah, and I'm just interested to see, what kind of situations do arise from this, because obviously so much of it will be, bridges that haven't yet been crossed, and situations we've never seen before, because this is kind of uncharted territory, of course, in college athletics. And so just to see kind of, you can already imagine with some of the stuff like, a player trying to, get a certain endorsement deal, and it being a conflict with the school, and the arbitration process that was kind of alluded to there. All that stuff will be very interesting to see. And, we might not be very far away from, seeing some of that stuff unfold here in a couple of months.
We are now about to the time of the show where I kicked the plug last time. I've got my legs as far away from anything electrical as possible. But at risk of anything else, any final thoughts on anything that we've talked about there, Griffin? I know we could probably go another 20 minutes on name, image, likeness, but I don't know if anybody wants to listen to another 20 minutes. I may sit there, and I've got a couple of friends that are in the arena of sports law. If we get good feedback on this conversation, maybe I'll try and get one of them on an edition of the BIA podcast next week to go through some things. But do you have anything else?
I mean, not particularly. I would say, one thing that was kind of interesting was I know I saw like Taraja Mitchell, for example, post like a link to maybe he's trying to do like a clothing brand or something like that. Not specifically pertaining to Ohio State, I guess, but just something that he would be able to make money through that I guess he would not have been able to earlier. Like he hasn't launched it yet, but he's like created like an accounts for it and things like that. So just stuff like that. I'm just interested to see, the different ways that different players, use these opportunities and things like that at the college level, and flipping the TV on and seeing current Ohio State players on a commercial and things like that. I'm very curious to see how it kind of unfolds.
Yeah, what I want to kind of see is how does this, how do these athletes get paid? I was talking with another writer on this beat who said, just wait until we get to the point that somebody is a holdout because they didn't get their, so-and-so company money or whatever. I mean, I think that might be a little bit of an overreaction that we're going to get to that point. But I mean, it certainly does, pose a lot of issues in terms of, while there may not be that veto power, if the university certainly tries to exert something to keep you from going and inking XYZ deal, does it create resentment or things of that nature? How does this get used in terms of recruiting? As everybody knows, we're on the eve of a big recruiting weekend or weekends starting in June for Ohio State. You're absolutely recruiting kids now, with NIL being something that is very real and will be something that will affect them all 4 years, all 3 to 5 years that they're on campus. So just so many little side stories that, this is certainly not the end of this conversation, but maybe the end of it for this afternoon as we are approaching 45 minutes. So, Griffin, I want to thank you for being part of the show. I'd like to say this second one was better than the first one that I wiped out with my big unruly feet.
Yeah, we got it down to, there's still time to mess it up, I guess, but, crossing our fingers here. But thanks for having me on, and I look forward to doing it again very soon.
Absolutely. And before I can screw anything up, I'm going to thank you for listening. Be sure to keep it locked in here at Buckeye Grove Instant Access, the BIA podcast. You can catch us on all of your favorite podcasting outlets. But I'm going to end it, and hopefully we can get through the close before I hit the wrong button. Once again, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Kevin Noon, and we will talk to you here very, very soon.
Be sure to stay up to date with Buckeye Grove Instant Access when the news breaks or after the big game. Exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher as part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network. Hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know and never miss a single episode.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing, and come visit us over at BuckeyeGrove.com for all the best Ohio State information on the web.